Thank you all for being here. This is the first evening of the two-day symposium, Shifting Trade Winds, APEC, Globalization, and the Pacific Northwest. I'm just going to say a couple of words about the impetus for this symposium and how it got started. PCC is a regional center of the Asian Studies Development Program at the East-West Center in Honolulu, and this symposium is made possible by a grant from the East-West Center. And we have with us tonight from the East-West Center Peter Hershock, who's in the back. Welcome, Peter. And I should say that it's PCC's affiliation with the East-West Center that allows us to host events such as this. So we're really thankful to have that relationship with the East-West Center. So as I said, tonight is the first night of the two-day symposium. Events continue tomorrow at Cascade Campus. If you're going to be there tomorrow, I should just note that there was an omission in the online schedule, that tomorrow's events will be at the Moriarty Auditorium. That's the Moriarty Arts and Humanities Auditorium. That's where we'll be all day tomorrow, starting at 8 o'clock. So we'll see you then. So for tonight, then, we'll get underway, and it's my pleasure to introduce you, to get us started off, the president of Portland Community College, Dr. Preston Pulliams.
Please give Tom a round of applause for his leadership in this effort, and thank you so much. Good evening, and it is a pleasure to join you and also welcome you as part of this effort. Let me just acknowledge someone real quickly, several people real quickly. I want to acknowledge tonight we've been joined by Dr. Stanty Thomas, our Fulbright Exchange Scholar from India, and his wife Shanti. Would you please stand to be recognized, please? Thank you. I also want to thank the East-West Center for the grant that funded this effort. Also, and I know our distinguished panel members and distinguished keynoter will be introduced in a few minutes, so I won't do those, but just thank you for being part of all of this. As I say, this is a real honor. These efforts are critical for our college here at Portland Community College because we are really committed to internationalizing our curriculum and to educating global citizens who can compete in a global marketplace. Our relationship with the East-West Center and this symposium are evidence, I feel, of that commitment. Higher education and community colleges in particular are on the front line of preparing today's students for the challenges and opportunities of reviving the economy in Oregon and the Pacific Northwest. Engagement with the Asian Pacific region is critical, absolutely critical in that mission. These discussions and efforts are also critical for our state's economy. Oregon exports are one of the bright spots of our state's economy, with international trade growing by 19% in the last year on nearly $18 billion in foreign sales. China is Oregon's largest trading partner, while Japan imports more of the state's agricultural products than any other nation. International trade affects every part of the state, with nearly 5,000 Oregon companies exporting their goods and services abroad, from large companies like Intel, Nike, all the way to wheat farmers in eastern Oregon, paddle makers in Bend, and motorcycle manufacturers in Ashland, Oregon. Please keep in mind that the 21 APEC member economies collectively account for more than half of the world's real GDP and purchasing power. This is a total of about, in US dollars, about 34 trillion for all the economies in 2008. So these economies also count for over 44% of the total world trade. In essence, and in closing, I'd just like to say we look forward to a great presentation, a provoking, lively discussion tonight and tomorrow about the opportunities and challenges the Asian Pacific region faces in the coming years, and the role higher education can play in their future. Please, again, we're proud to host you, and I ask everyone to please make themselves at home and enjoy our hospitality. And thank you all for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Pulliams. It is my pleasure to welcome now our keynote speaker tonight. We're very happy to have with us Professor Donald Hellman from the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. Professor Hellman's awards and fellowships and books are too numerous to mention tonight. I will say that he has been the director of the University of Washington's APEC Study Center since 1994. He's written or edited 6 major books on Asia and international relations and published more than 60 articles and monographs. He teaches courses on Japanese government and politics, American foreign policy, as well as the international relations of Northeast Asia. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Donald Hellman. Thank you.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank the East-West Center, and most particularly Portland Community College, for putting together a symposium, echoing the words that were just spoken about the importance of Asia, and in particular, people who live on the Pacific Rim. I think symposia like this are really important, and it was with pleasure that I agreed to come here. I've spent more years than most of you people are alive doing things like this, but I do it with gusto, with almost a missionary zeal. My specialty over the years has been on Japan, and I've lived there many years and written many books about Japan and Japanese politics and foreign policy. But I have, over the last several decades, have been deeply involved in the international relations of East Asia. And I was fortunate enough when President Clinton in Seattle, Washington, by coincidence, set up something called the APEC Study Centers. A brilliant idea, building on the fact that many of the countries in Asia are run by people, not just their universities, which are heavily run by people educated in the United States. And one of the greatest legacies of the Cold War has been the creation of this group of people whose experiences are not just what our government wants them to believe, but a result of their living here and getting to know the American people and, above all, American higher education on a first-hand basis. And so when President Clinton set up the APEC, the idea of the APEC Study Centers was to link, at that point, 58 universities run by people educated primarily, but not exclusively in the United States, to chart the future, not only of APEC, but of the Pacific Rim. I jumped in, and for 6 years ran the consortium of APEC study centers of universities in the United States, and made many trips to APEC meetings and summits and so forth. Actually, I was succeeded by Charles Morrison, who is now the head of the East-West Center. And he's an old and personal friend. I've known him for decades, actually. Now, my background, I tell you only because is a way of trying to say in a very few minutes a few things about APEC and about the United States' role in APEC and what the future holds for East Asia. Perhaps the most astonishing part of APEC is that the Americans didn't create it. Most changes in how the world is run happen after a global war, hegemonic war. That's when the League of Nations, the UN, an array of efforts, World Bank, all of this were created in the wake of a victory in war by the people who won that war. So we won the Cold War, not on the battlefield, but because there was this cataclysmic plop as the Soviet Union and its Eastern European empire collapsed. But what was astonishing was we did nothing. In fact, our president, the first Bush, said, "I have trouble with the vision thing." Now, this is close to saying I'm brain dead. I mean, here we are confronted with an opportunity of restructuring the global system, and our leader says, I'm not into ideas. This is relevant for APEC because one of the consequences of the Cold War years, which were extended, I mean, they nominally went from 1947 to the collapse, which 1989 or 90, resulted in cataclysmic changes in Asia. Japan was virtually bombed into the Stone Age in World War II. We rewrote their constitution for them, and the Japanese economic miracle ensued, where at one point, at the end of the Cold War, for at least a few weeks, nominally Japanese gross domestic product was bigger than ours, which is almost unbelievable. Asia had become not just Japan, but China, after a cataclysmic revolution that the worst, the most destructive the world had ever seen, resulted in the accession to power of the Chinese Communist Party. China turned a corner in the late 1970s, 1978 specifically, and it too became an economic powerhouse and has grown at a compounded rate of 11% a year to the present day. Soon China alone will be bigger than the United States. Japan has been immobilized, if you will, for a number of years, but they remain the third largest economy in the world. And as was earlier alluded to, the members of APEC are far bigger than the developed nations in Europe, and even including the United States for comparative purposes. Now, one would have thought that at the end of the Cold War, that this shift of power, which was evident all over the place. I have many anecdotes to tell about when Japan became a superpower. I was actually called one morning at 6 a.m. because somebody who had written an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal about the owner of Nintendo buying the Seattle Mariner baseball team. And they said this was a game for Americans, and even more particularly for white people in America. So I was running onto class, and I mumbled something about this was a racist thing by immature people who run sports events. So I pick up the phone, and the gentleman on the other end says, "Is this Jap lover Hellman?" And of course, I'm standing in my pajamas, and I said, "Well, who are you? I mean, what are you talking?" He said, "You're on the air in Detroit." And the next thing I knew, I was peppered for 2 hours explaining why I had said, in all innocence, a few honest things about it. That was the reaction to Japan when it was the challenge. We're hearing a similar echo now with China. And the Chinese are bigger than Japan, 4 times the size of us, maybe 5. And they're going to be bigger than we are, if they aren't already, depending on how you cut it. What is important about this is not just power, which is what you read about in the paper. Are we going to be number 2 or blah, blah, blah. The fact is that Asia is a very different world from America and Europe. Asia is, have cultural differences. If you seriously believe that Asia and Japan are going to converge to behave like Anglo-American capitalism and have produced 45,000 lawyers a year and have the kind of transparency we demand, you're dreaming. You're probably on a controlled substance of some sort. That's not going to happen. And just whether we fight wars to insist on the universality of American values or not, for the first time in the modern international era, since the Industrial Revolution, we have a non-Western aggregate of nations that are going to be bigger than we are. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to impose their values. They don't know any more about running the world than we do, and that's saying a lot right now. But the point is, this is where APEC comes in. APEC was the first comprehensive effort to tie together Asian nations. It was initiated by whom? By the Australians. By the Australians, and then the Koreans, and then the Japanese. And why did they do it? It had nothing to do with peace or the rise of Asia. It had to do with trying to keep the United States and Canada from exporting subsidized grain to the markets of Asia. And it was introduced by a socialist candidate for prime ministership of Korea. APEC itself was created on the campus of the university in Canberra, Australia, by two people in a book, I have a copy of which I've written edited several books about APEC. Peter Drysdale and Andrew Ellick were the two neoliberal economists trained in the West who created APEC, and not the United States. This was designed to keep the United States out of Asia. Now, just compare that with what we did at the end of World War II. We had the UN, we had Bretton Woods with the World Bank, the IMF. When that didn't work because of the Cold War, we had Pax Americana, we had NATO, we did nothing. APEC was a creature of Asian nations. Moreover, of course, the Koreans and the Japanese said, you must include the United States because our existence depends on the projection of American military power. So they said, okay, well, we'll include the United States. We have never embraced the concept of APEC, which is not to say bad things about APEC, but it's to say a lot about American leadership. By 1991, our then Secretary of State, James Baker, said the cornerstone of our Asian policy is APEC. Now, we had nothing to do with this. This was almost an accident. But our Secretary of State is now saying an organization green light. Now, what is APEC? It is an attempt to create a framework for discussion. It's a forum. In fact, sarcastically, it is 4 adjectives in search of a noun, which is often the way it is described. And the notion of form, people are really genuinely confused about what it is. Clearly, it is. Moreover, it is focused explicitly on economic, not political matters. That was the goal. That's why these two economists I described to you. It was essentially an argument to implement the free trade doctrine on countries whose economies were run not according to free trade doctrine, but by governments, by quite clearly government-led planning, which is astonishing in itself. But nevertheless, it was the first comprehensive effort to recognize that Asia was important. And more importantly, it brought in the United States and it brought in the Western world. Now, members of APEC include not only the United States, but Mexico, Peru, Chile, and so forth. And now Russia and others have joined. It was a kind of belated acknowledgement that the world had changed. But the second feature of APEC was it does not have a framework of organization that provides institutional memory, that imposes sanctions. It's a discussion group. It's the kind of stuff that professors go to and talk and result in, generating much hot air and often some interesting ideas, but very few actions. As such, it is a transitional institution. It is an institution that served a very useful purpose. And let me just quickly now, because time is fleeting, address 3 or 4 what I consider virtues of APEC. The first virtue is that as a forum, it was appropriate to relate, to function by relating the countries of East Asia and the Pacific. I mean, have Papua New Guinea being on the same par with China is really, or the United States, is really pushing it. But nevertheless, they are members, and even Taiwan is brought in as Taiwan. Now, this, of course, is of China because of the offense, political offense that would be taken by Beijing if it had done it. So it was a comprehensive forum, which was good. The second feature of it was that it quickly evolved into what I call an international extension school. That is to say, for many of the smaller countries of Southeast Asia, South and Southeast Asia, it became a place where their mid-range bureaucrats came and related to other mid-range bureaucrats and became international. For many of these people, they'd never even traveled outside of the country. People from Laos and Cambodia, few came to UW actually and took some of my classes that dealt with APEC because it was a new internationalizing experience. It's very, very good. But even more importantly, it was an international extension school for presidents of the United States. They were forced annually to either themselves go or send their vice presidents to Asia. Now, this is really, really significant. I mean, I can't underscore to you, without sounding too cynical, many of our presidents have not traveled abroad. I mean, Ronald Reagan had never been to Asia, I guarantee it, but he had to go there. He went there 8 times. And rubbing their noses in the fact that there is this thing and listening to this is very, very important. It forces an awareness of what's going on in the world that would not have been there. So the International Extension School of APEC. We were talking in the car, Ambassador McCulloch over there, about the business component of APEC. APEC is remarkable because in 1995, in the wake of the summit that was held in Seattle, an organization was created called ABAC, the APEC Business Advisory Council. It was funded almost exclusively by private sector money. It tapped into resources of multinational corporations that had long been investing in Asia and had their own organizations, PEC and PBEC and various other, that tried to coordinate their activities because they felt they were dealing in a world that was quite different from the world they dealt with when they were talking to Europe. Moreover, this has become institutionalized. ABAC is the only unit in APEC that is not governmental. They report regularly at the annual APEC summit on what they've been discussing. And they fund their own discussion groups. They're really very specific, very constructive. I think this is a model for future international organizations. Future international organizations are not simply going to be sovereign nations. They're going to have to encompass where the power is. And clearly the power, I mean, many ways GE and Microsoft have much more interesting and complex and certainly more successful foreign policies than the United States of America. And if you ever took the trouble to study them, you would understand, yeah, Bill Gates flies in, heads of state, and surreptitiously. After the Battle of Seattle, where people from Oregon were involved in that one, the Battle of Seattle was followed in 4 months by a meeting convened by Microsoft that flew in 15 heads of state and 50 cabinet members, many of them foreign ministers. I didn't even know about it. I mean, in fact, because one of the heads of state wanted to meet me, which upset the university no end because, you know, the Secret Service agents were involved and all that. But no one in the public even knew it. Now, clearly it was to make money. They were trying to establish cyber parks in various countries and were willing to subsidize their establishment. But the point is that non-governmental institutions cannot function in a globalized world without being sensitive to not only the economics, but the politics of how the world holds together. And there is no way that future international organizations are not going to, in one way or another, directly involve, for everybody's benefit. Now, businessmen don't think about international public goods. I wish they did. But you can't leave the future of the world to the conscience of who happens to be president of some. You have to encase them in a responsible position in the process itself. And while it may take time, it will provide institutional limitations. APEC is truly a pioneer on that, and perhaps at some point the ambassador may speak about this. He's actively involved in it. I think it is the most distinctive and probably the most enduring aspect of APEC itself, and so I don't want to. Another aspect of APEC, despite the fact these economists said the world is we're only going to deal with economics, we're not going to deal with this dirty stuff of politics. That's, most economists say that. They consider politics to be non-rational behavior. Everything is not rational if it's not economically calculated. But despite all of this effort to shut out political matters, what's happened is that among the most significant aspects of APEC are what are called bilaterals. That is to say, the heads of state get together, and if you're a politician, any chance to talk, particularly if there's a photographer around, is not to be avoided. And so every year, there are bilateral between China and the United States, Japan and Korea, and so in spite of its effort to sanitize it politically, they in fact provide a network of communication that is concerned with day-to-day diplomacy in a very constructive way. Two more comments on positives of APEC. One is that we have a significant, I would argue, inadequate number of institutions trying to manage the global economy. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, both of them were created for purposes radically different from what's going on now. I mean, one was the International Monetary Fund, which is now basically a banker of last resort for the world, was created to modify exchange rates in the wake of World War II, to manage them. The World Bank was created to rebuild the world that was destroyed pretty much by World War II in Europe and most of Asia. Now the World Bank works to deal with developing nations. And the whole set of formula, in other words, the whole formula of what goes on there is not being manifested. And, you know, the latest one, what is it called? G20. Can you imagine 20 nations, primarily heads of state, deciding the technical aspects of restructuring the international financial system? I mean, after witnessing what goes on in our Congress, they can't decide anything. But to add, or what Europe, what the common market is doing, it's extremely difficult. It's important, it's good, it dignifies developing nations by including them. That's very important, both psychological and empirically. But China's voting rights in the IMF were raised. Now, mind you, China's going to be bigger than we are very soon, so that their voting rights equaled the country of Belgium. Now, do you really think that's a satisfactory acknowledgement of a change in the international system? That's absurd. It's not right or wrong. A wholesale change is necessary. How does APEC fit into this? Well, APEC itself is a forum. It's a venue in which ideas can be vetted, where, and to be sure, they have done so. The weaknesses are that these ideas are never funded. They are never implemented. The biggest failure of APEC was in 1997 Asian financial crisis. At that point, it was a crisis. Now, of course, we had a worse one with the Great Recession, which we're still in the middle of. But up to that point, that was the biggest international financial crisis since the Great Depression. APEC was uniquely suited to do that. The meeting was being held in Vancouver, BC. Attending would be the CEOs from APEC and others, as well as the heads of state. And what did they do? President Clinton said, well, that's a Japanese problem. Let them deal with it. The Japanese punted even further down the road. And so nothing happened. And from that point on, APEC became simply a forum and not a kind of a catalyst for defining the road to the future. Indeed, and I will end with just 2 more points. Indeed, what has happened in the wake of the Asian financial crisis was just an explosion of new regional organizations in Asia. ASEAN +1, ASEAN +3, the Asian Summit. What thread runs through them is Asia is becoming turned in on itself. The Pacific Rim has become the Asian Rim, or the Asian shore. The United States is out. Now, we are in the Asian Summit. But the point is the impetus for creating not only these broader institutions, or the Chiang Mai, I don't want to bore you with all this stuff, the Chiang Mai Initiative, there's another one to replace the IMF by stocking up resources, foreign exchange reserves in Bangkok to deal with any potential crisis that came down the road. So the tension between regionalism and globalism in Asia is reflected in the reduced importance of APEC itself, and most importantly, in the continuing failure of the United States to give priority emphasis to Asia. Which leads me around to why this meeting is being held in the first place. Because places like the East-West Center, whose mission is to precisely do the opposite of this, to promote the importance of Asia, and people in the academic world and elsewhere in the private sector that are involved in Asia should be shouting from the housetops the importance of Asia and how it works out. There's a long way to go on this. In the challenge between regionalism in Asia and globalization, in many ways, is symbolized by the problems of APEC, which is really what you can see why I'm winding up on this note. APEC was a brave new idea. It was a transitional institution. Transitional to what? Well, the world is waiting for a new framework, both global and regional, to address the problems of what will soon be, without question, the largest economic region in the world. The danger is that the United States will not only see its position in the world decline, which it obviously will happen, that's not a great catastrophe. We'll still be the most powerful country in the world, with militarily and other ways, but we're not going to be a leader. To be a leader, you have to have values and ideas that are accepted by others. You have to create a framework that promotes understanding and promotes cooperation and ultimately peace. And that's the real challenge for the United States, and it's symbolized in many ways by APEC. We're going to have an APEC meeting in November in Hawaii, and there will be a follow-up one in Vladivostok when the Russians stick their nose into the APEC situation in 2012. Both of these meetings, these summits, they're called APEC summits, where everybody goes and APEC is in the center of things, provide an occasion for addressing the challenges that I've just outlined. How to realistically incorporate Asia with its unique, highly successful models for economic growth and political order into a globalized world, which we're not going to disappear. Our values, whether they're universally applied or not, we're not going to change. I'm not going to change. I mean, I even served in the U.S. Army. I mean, I'm a true believer in probably human rights in particular, and civil rights are that's where I give my money. But we're not going to change. But somehow, an arrangement that incorporates our different, equally successful, highly successful, and powerful system with a new emerging arrangement centered on the other side of the Pacific. This will be the challenge for the first half of the 21st century and perhaps beyond it. Let me stop there.
So I think we have a few minutes for Q&A for Professor Hellman, and we have some microphones that we can hand to folks who have questions. If you have a question, maybe you can stand up and we'll find you with mic. Questions or comments, reactions?
My students usually just get upset when I speak. Because what I have said is not accepted wisdom in Washington, D.C. I can assure you that. Yeah, there's a question back there, yes.
Yeah, we met earlier this evening, and my question is, I've seen a study anyway that shows that the U.S. and China on several different scores, be they economic, political, and so on, cross paths in about 2040.
Right.
And that the U.S. is not paying, or the U.S. leadership is not paying any attention to this, and the dynamic of how to fit into the emerging world, if you will.
Right. Well, that's the theme of my comments. The dates, that was the 240 number was a CIA study on the future published about 5 years ago. For good or for ill, the number now is 230 to 220 and perhaps even down from there. We don't need to worry about the specifics. That barring a radical collapse of China, which would be catastrophic. They own a quarter of our national debt. I mean, and they're stuck with us just the way we're stuck with them. That's what they're just beginning to figure that out. The first the point you make is correct, and we are not paying sufficient attention. The second point is that the establishment in foreign policy in the United States is monumentally wedded to the past, to the ideas of the past. In the worst case, it's when the Cold War ended, Frank Fukuyama and some other people, who was a State Department official, I think he's now a professor at Stanford, said history is over. The West has won. Democracy and capitalism and freedom, and peace as we know it, have triumphed. Well, that's not true. And let the party begin. Things have changed. I don't have to elaborate that. And that's the most extreme. The second, the more realistic group, Fred Bergston, who runs a very famous Peterson Institute, he said, well, the world has changed, but it's G2. It's China versus the United States. Well, first of all, if I imply, which I do, that the United States cannot run the world according to the principles they did in the past, that applies to China in spades. They have no idea. They may have the power, But the notion that you're going to create a framework to promote peace and prosperity that transcends the national self-interest of Beijing, if you can, I will take notes if any of you can give evidence that this is expressed. So the problem is that it's not just, to answer your question, it's not just the United States, it's that there is this international vacuum of leadership. And we may be losing the power war or the economic war. We'll never really lose it completely. And we're not going to collapse. That's absurd. We may have large unemployment for an extended period, and we have to make some very severe adjustments internally. But the notion the United States will sink giggling into the seas around it is simply not true. I mean, that's not going to happen. If it does, then meetings like this, forget about it. East-West Center will disappear. You won't have any. I mean, if we collapse, the economic consequences and the political, because when you have a cataclysmic economic collapse, as you did in the Great Depression, what happened? You got political radicalism of Adolf Hitler and Japanese nationalism. It's the political consequences of economic collapse, not the other ones that are important. So the importance of understanding Asia means the importance of bringing Asia into the world, not just ignoring them. We've got to get our own act together. I mean, that would be my complaint. But more importantly, somehow a framework for understanding that transcends what was set up in APEC, which was just this amorphous forum, has got to be put in place. And up to now, I have seen very little evidence that either Asia or the United States is at awareness. This is the challenge for you people and who come to meetings like this and listen to people like me. I mean, I'm not going to do it. It's all up to you. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a little pessimistic. I just came back from China after spending 21 days over there visiting 9 countries. And I haven't studied Asia. I haven't studied China, but I see these 5-year plans, and then I come back here, and we can't even figure out our budget for the next 30 days. And I'm just wondering if our political system is going to be able to compete with the Chinese, who say there's a lack of leadership there. But there seems to be a lot of leadership there. There seems to be a lot of vision, and they seem to be accomplishing an awful lot. Today they sent up a satellite. Okay, they're looking at putting a space station up there in the next 3 or 4 years. They're talking about sending a man up to the moon by 1920. They've got all these bullet trains going from city to city. There are universities. I spent a lot of time in the colleges, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These kids are studying hard. I'm just wondering. I'm a bit worried about what's going to happen in this country with our two-party system and one party always trying to kick out the other party and nothing really being able to seem to get done.
Well, if I had an answer to your comment, I probably wouldn't be speaking here. But the point you make is incontestable. I mean, the dysfunction of our political system, to be professorial for a moment, what I say in my seminars is the countries that will truly succeed in the 21st century are those that recruit leadership, particularly political and economic leadership, most effectively. And if you ask that question about the United States, yes, if you ask that question about the United States, our elite recruitment process, to put it modestly, is a disaster. I compare, I've had some dealings with Russia, but whatever you may think of Vladimir Putin, he has an advanced degree in energy. He speaks 4 languages. He was a colonel in the KGB. What do you think he would do in a debate with Sarah Palin, who did not know there were 2 Koreas? Now, that's not just hypothetical. The recruitment process is hopeless. And I don't know, the United States recruited leaders only when we're in crisis, in the 30s and 40s. Most of the time, and you people are partly responsible. How many of you want to leave Portland or Oregon? I mean, you know, why would you want to go and live in Washington, D.C. and yell at people for no purpose if you could enjoy the pleasures of your campus? And that's what most Americans do. The best and the brightest find other ways to seek satisfaction. And in China, of course, they were torn apart by the world's most thorough and horrible revolution. It was a tragedy. It's not people that extol it. It was a tragedy. 150 million people died. And there are still 500 million Chinese living in poverty. And it's very unclear how, in our terms, they're going to, but it's not in our terms. I mean, if they're happy, and if they, and that's what you have to accept. And you have good reason for being concerned, because by any standard, they are recruiting elites. I may not like it. I'd be in jail in China probably in 2 days if I were a regular citizen. But you may not like what they're doing, but it's a formula that's working. And it's working at a level for the first time that matters in the world. And they own a lot of our debt. And they're going to own more. And therefore, the challenge is not just this hypothetical stuff you get in these academic discussions. This is really, anybody who goes to China and witnesses this comes back just scratching their head. And I don't know. Washington, D.C. is living in a bubble. And they don't, the kind of talk I'm giving would never even appear on, you know, at a major media operation, because all they're interested in is shifting the chairs around. Perhaps on the Titanic would be an appropriate way of doing it, without seeing it in a broader international context. Yeah, there was one question. Let me know if we got to cut it off.
I think we can take one more.
Okay, fine. Thank you. Yes.
Hi. I have a question for you about bureaucracy and its role in economic development.
Yes.
If we're to believe American policymakers, bureaucracy gets in the way. But if someone who studied political science, and I teach political science on PCC's Rock Creek campus right here, most of the scholarship indicates that governmental bureaucracy has helped to advance the countries of Japan, South Korea, and China in a great way. And so I'm wondering if there's any movement to try and get our American leadership to realize this, and if they actually did and turn things around, do you think corporations would actually go along with a partnership with governmental bureaucracy in this country to further economic development here?
That's a good question. First, as I'm a student of Japan, I've spent more than a small amount of time on this. There are a couple of fundamental differences. Richard Nixon tried to create a Japanese equivalent of the Japanese Ministry of International Trade and Industry in 1974. The Ministry of International Trade and Industry in Japan is commonly seen, whether rightly or wrongly, as the architect of the Japanese economic miracle. Moreover, the best and brightest in Japan went to the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. I often ask my classes in Japanese politics, how many of you have awakened in the middle of the night saying you wanted to be a bureaucrat in the Department of the Treasury in Washington? And, you know, apart from a few smart-mouthed and defiant students, the answer is, of course, no one. And moreover, that means that our bureaucrats, while technically competent, are not the best and brightest. The best and brightest, if you're born in Oregon, will come back and enjoy what you can do in Oregon, not go back. And that's not in a place like China. That's the first point. Second point is the sense of hierarchy and deference to authority. I wouldn't want the American bureaucrats running our economy. I mean, because people that go into the bureaucracy, and fortunately I've spent a lot of time in Washington, and it's somewhat depressing, actually. And but technocracy is really what you're hinting at. You're absolutely right. I mean, in a world in which we live, and I'll end on this, security in the 21st century is not simply military security. It entails global health. It entails a digital revolution. Cybersecurity will be as important or more important than nuclear security. If it isn't already, I would argue probably isn't. People don't want to blow things up. What can you rule if you blow everything up? Wars are fought for advantages. I mean, if you could shut down the United States by hacking into the right computer, you'd have the country to deal with. If you blew it up, what would you have? A radioactive pile. So cybersecurity, the digital revolution, the whole array of issues that require technical competence. You have to, I mean, it's absurd to argue that all bureaucracy is bad. I mean, the criticism of bureaucracy, once you establish it, getting it to change is difficult, almost impossible. And someone would get 6 Nobel Prizes if they came up with a theory of how to disestablish bureaucracy, either national or international, I guarantee it. But nevertheless, this is a phony argument about government. All government is bad. And similarly, the Japanese will fail because they have too much bureaucracy. Yeah, bureaucracy in Japan is rigid. And you don't necessarily, I've dealt with these young men that go in the Ministry of Finance. They sit in these rooms. They would never, in a room like this would be so lavish. They sit in rooms with dirty windows and little desks stuffed in. They all dress in blue suits with white shirts, and they never smile, and they type rapidly on their computers, and they're frightening. They're so efficient. You don't want that. What you do want is the creation of entities, whether they're partnerships, linking the private sector with. Maybe the best way to put this, in World War II, the head of the Department of Defense was the president of General Motors, who worked for $1 a day because he believed in the national purpose. And what you need is a sense of responsibility. Infused, the corporate sector is flourishing. I mean, but to argue all government bureaucracy is incompetent and is a culture-bound and very myopic point of view. Europe's not like that. The European universities, starting with the German and the French, are public administration universities. That's where they're trained. And the Japanese emulated them. The Japanese Hogakubu, the law faculty in every major imperial university and now post-war, are patterned after the Europeans. They train people to go serve in the bureaucracy. Now, there's no reason we couldn't do this or something like it. Let me end on that. I've enjoyed the questions and the talk, and I think you're going to have to enjoy it.